They pulled her over for no reason, humiliated her, and acted like they were untouchable. But what they didn't know, they just made the biggest mistake of their careers. Two officers stopped an elderly black woman, accusing her of looking suspicious. They insulted her, tore through her belongings, and laughed as if they'd won. But this wasn't just any woman. They didn't realize she held the key to exposing their racism in front of the entire department. By the time the truth came out, they weren't just sorry, they were ruined. Stay tuned, because this story will leave you shocked. Mary Johnson, a 72-year-old grandmother, never expected her quiet drive home to turn into a public spectacle. She just finished picking up some groceries, a mundane part of her day, but to the two officers who spotted her on the road, she was anything but ordinary. To them, she was a problem, a black woman behind the wheel of a decent car, something they decided didn't fit into their narrow-minded narrative. The officers, Mark and Todd, had a reputation for their aggressive tactics in the neighborhood. They thrived on targeting people they thought wouldn't fight back those without power or connections. When they saw Mary driving her old but well-maintained car, they didn't hesitate. With lights flashing and sirens blaring, they pulled her over, setting the stage for what would become a blatant display of racial profiling. As Mary rolled down her window, trying to stay calm, Mark approached with an air of authority that was more hostile than professional. "License and registration," he barked, his tone devoid of respect. Mary complied, handing over her documents with steady hands, but Todd, standing on the other side of the car, wasn't interested in paperwork. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her car as if searching for evidence of a crime. Mary explained that she lived nearby and was just heading home, but her words fell on deaf ears. Mark scoffed, tossing her license back toward her. "This car doesn't seem like it belongs to someone like you," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The implication was clear, and it cut deep. But it didn't stop there. Todd motioned for her to step out of the car, insisting they needed to search it. When Mary hesitated, Mark leaned closer, his voice low but threatening. "If you've got nothing to hide, then you won't mind stepping out." Mary, a law-abiding citizen all her life, felt the pressure and stepped out, even though she knew she'd done nothing wrong. What happened next was nothing short of humiliating. Todd rummaged through her car, tossing items onto the pavement as if her belongings were trash. Her carefully packed groceries were scattered, and her purse was emptied out, its contents on full display for passersby to see. But the final blow came when Todd pulled out a small family photo that Mary kept tucked in her sun visor. "Who's this? Your rich employer?" he sneered, holding up the photo of Mary with her son. Mary's voice shook as she responded, "That's my son." The officers laughed as if her answer was some sort of joke. The entire scene drew a small crowd, neighbors peeking out from windows and pedestrians stopping to watch. Mary felt the weight of their stares, not because she was guilty, but because she was being treated like a criminal. Her dignity was being stripped away piece by piece, and the officers showed no sign of letting up. When they finally finished their search, they found nothing. No stolen goods, no contraband, no evidence of any wrongdoing. But instead of apologizing or letting her go, they escalated the situation. "We're taking you in for resisting," Mark announced smugly, slapping handcuffs onto Mary's wrists. "Resisting?" Mary repeated, incredulous. She hadn't resisted anything. She'd followed their every instruction, endured their insults, and complied with their unreasonable demands. Yet here she was, a 72-year-old woman in handcuffs, being paraded like a criminal for a crime she didn't commit. Before they shoved her into the patrol car, Mary turned to them with tears in her eyes. But instead of pleading, she simply said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." The officers laughed, dismissing her words as the ramblings of a powerless old woman. They had no idea what was coming. To them, Mary was just another easy target, someone who wouldn't dare fight back. They didn't know that the same photo they mocked, the one of her and her son, held the key to their undoing. The scene was more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a glaring example of the systemic racism that allowed officers like Mark and Todd to act with impunity. It wasn't just Mary's humiliation on display, it was the failure of a system that had emboldened them. What they saw as just another day at work was about to turn into the reckoning of a lifetime. As Mary sat in the back of the patrol car, her mind raced. She'd done nothing wrong, she knew it. The officers knew it. And now the small crowd gathering on the street likely knew it too. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. Not when the people in power, like officers Mark and Todd, refused to listen. Mark and Todd, on the other hand, felt untouchable. To them, Mary wasn't a person. She was just another target, someone they could bully without consequences. They exchanged smug glances as they drove her to the station, completely unaware of the chain reaction they were about to set in motion. At the station, things didn't get any better for Mary. She was booked, fingerprinted, and made to sit in a cold holding cell with little explanation beyond vague accusations of resisting. Every step of the process felt like another attempt to strip her of her dignity. But Mary wasn't one to crumble under pressure. She sat there quietly, waiting for her opportunity not to lash out, but to prove them wrong. Meanwhile, Mark and Todd couldn't stop talking about how easy their day had been. "Did you see her face when we cuffed her?" Todd chuckled. Mark leaned back in his chair and added, "Another one for the books." These people never learn. Their words echoed through the precinct, loud enough for others to hear, but too familiar for anyone to challenge. What they didn't know was that their actions were already catching up to them. In the booking process, Mary had provided her emergency contact information. And when that call was made, it didn't go to just anyone, it went to Chief Daniels, the head of the police department. Chief Daniels was no ordinary police chief. Known for his strict discipline and zero tolerance for misconduct, he had spent years trying to clean up the department's reputation. But this call wasn't about just any case, it was personal. Mary wasn't just a victim of racial profiling. She was his mother. The moment Chief Daniels heard what had happened, he was on his way to the precinct. He didn't waste time with phone calls or paperwork. This was something he needed to handle in person. The drive to the station was short, but for Chief Daniels, it felt like an eternity. Back at the precinct, Mary remained calm, her quiet strength unsettling even the officers who weren't directly involved. Todd passed by her cell and muttered, "Bet you didn't think you'd end up here today, huh?" Mary didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew her silence would speak volumes soon enough. When Chief Daniels arrived, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted immediately. Officers straightened up, whispers spread, and Mark and Todd, oblivious to the storm heading their way, continued joking in the break room. Daniels didn't waste time. He went straight to the holding cells, and when he saw Mary sitting there, his heart broke. "Mom," he said softly, his voice a mix of anger and sadness. Mary looked up, her eyes calm but tired. "I told them they were making a mistake," she said simply. Daniels turned to the officers escorting him and demanded to know who had brought her in. The air grew tense as Mark and Todd were called to the front desk, still unaware of what was happening. When they saw Chief Daniels standing there, they froze. They didn't need an introduction. His face was plastered on the walls of every precinct in the city. "Chief," Mark stammered, "what brings you here?" Daniels didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured for Mary to be released. As she walked out of the cell, Daniels turned to the two officers, his expression cold. "This is my mother," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "The woman you humiliated, insulted, and arrested for no reason. Care to explain yourselves?" Mark and Todd stood speechless, their arrogance evaporating in an instant. The weight of their actions hit them like a freight train. Not only had they targeted an innocent woman, but they had also crossed a line that would cost them everything. The other officers in the precinct watched in silence as Chief Daniels called for an immediate investigation. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. For Mark and Todd, the reality of their actions was just beginning to sink in. Their smugness was gone, replaced by fear and shame. For Mary, however, it wasn't about revenge. As she stood beside her son, she only wanted one thing: accountability. She didn't need an apology, though one would come eventually. What she needed, and what Chief Daniels promised to deliver, was justice. The precinct was eerily quiet as Chief Daniels stood before officers Mark and Todd. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and even the other officers, who weren't directly involved, watched with unease. The smug arrogance Mark and Todd had displayed all day vanished as the realization sank in. The woman they had targeted wasn't just anyone. She was the mother of the police chief. "This is my mother," Chief Daniels said, his voice calm but laced with unmistakable authority. "The woman you dragged out of her car, humiliated, and arrested without cause. Explain yourselves." "Now," Mark stammered, searching for words. "Sir, we were following protocol," he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. Todd, usually the louder of the two, was suddenly mute, his eyes darting around the room as though looking for an escape. "Protocol?" Daniel snapped, his voice rising. "You call racial profiling and public humiliation protocol? Searching her car without cause? Throwing her belongings onto the ground? Handcuffing a 72-year-old woman who did nothing wrong? That's your idea of protocol?" Mark and Todd had no response. They both stood frozen, their faces pale. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Daniel slamming his hand on the desk. "Look at her," he shouted, pointing to Mary, who stood quietly behind him. "Look at the woman you treated like a criminal. Does she look like a threat to you?" Mary, despite the humiliation she'd endured, carried herself with dignity. She didn't interrupt or demand an apology. She let her son take the lead, knowing he would handle it. Her quiet strength spoke volumes, making the officer's behavior seem even more disgraceful in comparison. The tension escalated when Daniels turned to the other officers in the precinct. "Did any of you step in? Did anyone question what these two were doing? Or did you all just stand by and let it happen?" His piercing gaze swept across the room, making even those uninvolved shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Chief," Todd finally blurted out, "we didn't know." "You didn't know what?" Daniels interrupted sharply. "That she was my mother? That doesn't matter. Whether she's my mother or a stranger, your actions were unacceptable. And you think not knowing excuses your behavior? You think that erases what you did?" Todd fell silent again, and Daniels didn't wait for more excuses. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice lowering but no less commanding. "You've not only disrespected my mother, but you've disgraced this department. This uniform is supposed to stand for justice, for fairness, for protection. What you did today was none of those things." The room was so still you could hear a pin drop. The other officers avoided making eye contact with Mark and Todd, who now looked like they wished the ground would swallow them whole. Daniels took a deep breath and addressed the entire precinct. "This isn't just about two bad cops. This is about a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Not anymore. Not on my watch." He turned back to Mark and Todd. "Effective immediately, you are both suspended without pay pending a full investigation. Hand over your badges and firearms." Now, the two officers hesitated, but one look at Daniel's face was enough to make them comply. They removed their badges and weapons, placing them on the desk with trembling hands. As they were escorted out of the precinct, the rest of the officers stood in stunned silence. It wasn't every day they witnessed such a swift and public reckoning, especially from someone as high-ranking as Daniels. But it was clear to everyone present that this wasn't just about setting an example, it was personal. Mary turned to her son, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you," she said. "But I don't want this to be just about me. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Daniels nodded. "It won't," he promised. "This department is going to change starting now." Mary's quiet strength and Daniel's firm leadership sent a powerful message not just to the precinct, but to the community as well. What began as an act of hate and arrogance had transformed into a moment of accountability and change. For Mark and Todd, their actions had cost them not only their jobs, but also their reputations. They had been exposed for who they truly were, and there was no coming back from it. For Mary and Chief Daniels, however, the moment was about more than just justice. It was about hope. Hope that even in the face of systemic injustice, change was possible, and that standing up for what's right could make a difference. What started as a humiliating traffic stop turned into a powerful moment of accountability. Mary Johnson, a 72-year-old grandmother, endured injustice with quiet strength, only for the truth to expose her tormentors. Chief Daniels, her son, and the head of the precinct, didn't just defend his mother, he set an example by holding officers Mark and Todd accountable for their actions. The officers lost their badges, their reputation, and the false sense of power they abused. Mary's dignity remained intact, and her ordeal became a turning point, sending a clear message. Injustice, no matter how deeply rooted, will not go unchecked. Subscribe for more stories like this, or check out the next video for another powerful tale. Please note this is not a real story. It's a fictional story for educational and entertainment purposes.